I'm Adam Ramsay and I'm editor of Open Democracy UK. So the Democratic Unionist Party is the more radical, as in more extreme, of the two unionist parties in Northern Ireland. And just to get the language right, because I know people in Britain often forget this, unionist means union with the UK. Traditionally, nationalist or Republican means they want to be part of Ireland. So these are, a Protestant party. They are, and of the two parties, the other one is called the Ulster Unionist Party, which is traditionally sat with the Conservative Party, and this election was totally wiped out, lost its two MPs. And the DUP was originally a fringe party in Northern Ireland, which over the last decade or two has grown up to be the main party of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. And they can only be described as a hard right party. They are a party, they've had their MP, one MP recently was caught up in a scandal where a member of the public said that ethnics needed to be sent home. And the MP said, yes, you're quite right. And Jeffrey Donaldson, their longest standing MP, says on his, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, says on his website that he started politics as Enoch Powell's campaign manager. So for those who aren't familiar, Enoch Powell, who was originally a Conservative MP, gave his Rivers of Blood speech. He turned towards fascism and then had to go and stand in Northern Ireland because the Conservative Party weren't going to put up with that. And Jeffrey Donaldson is the man who then ran his campaign in Northern Ireland. He says this proudly on his own website to get him elected there. So, he's still talking about how great Enoch Powell, the kind of most famous British fascist of the modern era, is. This is a party which works very hard to fight a woman's right to choose to have an abortion, and so as a result in Northern Ireland you still don't have abortion rights, and it's a huge problem for women there. They're fighting against equal marriage rights for LGBT couples, and so there's huge problems for LGBT people there, and a party that is rank with bigotry throughout its ranks. And people in Northern Ireland give you endless examples of the sort of hard bigotry of the DUP. Okay, so we need to go back a bit in history to think about this. And remember that, when I was a kid, so I was born in 1985, there was still a significant conflict between the two communities in Northern Ireland. And that's a complex conflict, and I won't go into the history of all of it, but both sides had people in them, and most people in Northern Ireland have always wanted peace, but both sides had people in them who were killing other people, who were involved in violence. And people often forget this. They remember the IRA, but they forget there was also loyalist terrorist groups, the UDA, the UVF, etc. And the DUP was absolutely involved in one of those paramilitary groups, specifically called Ulster Resistance. So just like Sinn Féin has very close links with the IRA, the DUP has historical links with Ulster Resistance, which, for example, in the 80s was caught running huge amounts of armaments, including very heavy weaponry, along with the other harder terrorist groups on the loyalist side in Northern Ireland. So that all happens. In 1997, the Irish and British and American governments get together and they get the two sides to agree a peace deal, which is known as the Good Friday Agreement, which is both ratified by referendum in the north of Ireland and also in the Republic of Ireland, and is an international treaty as well. And part of the process there is that the two governments, the British government and the Irish government, have a responsibility to mediate between these two sides. And Britain says, at this point, it doesn't have a strategic interest in Northern Ireland remaining in the UK. It's up to the people of Northern Ireland to decide its constitutional future. And that's how they get peace. We're not taking sides in this conflict, we're neutral in this conflict. Now, 20 years on, if you go to Northern Ireland now, this is still a community that is divided by massive walls. We talk about, the wall that Trump wants to build between USA and Mexico. Bits of Belfast and all the main cities in Northern Ireland literally have massive physical barriers between the Catholic and Protestant communities in order to stop them fighting and killing each other. So this isn't a community at ease with itself. It's still got serious problems. There have been, there's been relative peace for a long time, and that's a very good thing. But it's still a tense situation. There were riots in Belfast in 2013 or so because loyalists, who are the kind of more hardcore of the pro-Britain unionists, were upset that maybe the British flag wasn't going to fly from the Belfast City Hall every day of the week. This is people are rioting over a flag. There's still very heavy tension there, which is partly a consequence of austerity and people, reverting to their communities in a time of austerity. And then you have Brexit. And what Brexit means for Northern Ireland is potential disaster, because it means a potentially hard border between the north of Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the island of Ireland. And if you think what that means for a business that is regularly trying to get a van in to, take crops or whatever it sells from Dublin, or, you think what it means for people who commute in, because lots of people will work, for example, in one of the towns or cities in Northern Ireland, but live in the Republic, or vice versa. It's a small place and there's endless people crossing the borders. And so if this suddenly becomes a frontier of the EU, then there's a real question about what kind of border you have. And this has already created real conflict in Northern Ireland. Not violent conflict like you had before, but real, difficulties and tensions within the community. And then what happened earlier this year is that the Northern Irish Assembly government collapsed. So part of the Good Friday Agreement was that the two different halves of the community had to both be involved in the governance of Northern Ireland. So you'd always have a Northern Irish Assembly government, which is made up of parties from both sides. Because of a major scandal involving the DUP, where basically they took about £500 million that was spent on a renewable energy subsidy scheme, although they're mostly climate change deniers, which subsidised people to have wood chip boilers. And lots of people made a lot of money out of these wood chip boilers, and there's a lot of allegations about who made that money and who knew about the scheme, and people have been accused of a lot of corruption. And Arlene Foster, the leader of the DUP, was very involved in her former job as a minister in setting this scheme up. So Sinn Féin have said they're not going to work with Arlene Foster because they think that she's involved in this, totally scandalous scheme. So you've already got all this pressure. The government's collapse in Northern Ireland. Very worrying situation for everyone who follows Northern Irish politics. And then Theresa May blithely says that she's willing to do a deal with one side of that community, when the other side, she's not going to deal with, they're not represented in Westminster because Sinn Féin don't sit in Westminster. She's willing to deal with one side, which could mean that, we essentially unravel the Good Friday Agreement, because if the DUP is involved in government, the government is taking a side in that conflict. And in the context that we already have a very worrying situation there, that's a real problem. So I think it's worth thinking about, in a way, the role of a lot of British society in this. So, for example, on the night of the election, David Dimbleby on TV was talking about how it's obvious that Theresa May would do a deal with the DUP. Now, in the 90s, John Major, for people who remember, gradually lost his majority through a series of by-elections after the 1992 election. But throughout that process, he refused to do a deal with the DUP because he understood that peace in Northern Ireland was more important than him remaining Prime Minister. Theresa May was, easily facilitated in a way by a lot of people who just didn't understand the difference between the UUP, the Tories' traditional allies, who are much more moderate, who, people who weren't involved in violence in the same sorts of ways, and so on. But because people didn't challenge them early on, I think absolutely Theresa May has got away with basically putting her political career ahead of peace in Northern Ireland, and that's totally disgraceful. I think that there's two different questions. The first is the influence the DUP will have over the rest of the UK, and I expect the answer to that is actually not very much. They're not that interested in that. They will maybe try and push things like abortion reductions, but I expect they won't get that through. Obviously that's a thing that needs to be fought, but I expect they won't get that through. My worry is more that they'll get a whole load of stuff to do with Northern Ireland through that people in the rest of the UK won't understand or care about or notice. It's really damaging. So one thing that's already been talked about is the abolition of a thing called the Parades Commission. And the role of parades in Northern Ireland is something that people of our generation in Britain have never really thought about, particularly in England. In Scotland, because you have orange marches, there's more of an understanding of this. But what this means is, the Parades Commission was set up in order to ensure that, for example, you didn't get big orange walks, which is where people get up in their their paramilitary uniforms and they go and they bang their drums and they march, and it all looks from the outside like it's perfectly nice day out. But what they're doing is they're going through Catholic communities and singing provocative songs, often, songs that are effectively about killing Catholics and so on. And they're trying to seek conflict. This cuts both ways to an extent about who gets to march where and so on. But the reason they want to ban the Parades Commission has stopped them doing things. The Parades Commission was set up in order to facilitate the peace process. It stopped them doing things which really are provocative and likely to cause violence in Northern Ireland. It's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. But can you imagine Theresa May going, no one in Britain is going to notice or care if we let them abolish the Parades Commission, so let's just let them have it? Of course you can imagine them doing that. So my real worry is that there's a whole set of issues that in Northern Ireland are very important and vital to people there, and absolutely about the power dynamic between the two different communities in Northern Ireland, but which people outside Northern Ireland understand so little that the Tories will think it's politically very easy for them to concede on in these negotiations. Well, so Theresa May is in an astonishingly weak position. I was always convinced she would never be stupid enough to call a snap election, because it was obviously going to be a massive risk to do so. And she did so. She has lost her majority in that process. She is clinging onto her personal career. She's widely blamed within the Tories for doing so badly. Now, in a way, I think that's a mistake. And Theresa May is awful, but it's also because Jeremy Corbyn did very well in this election, and the Labour Party and all the activists who got out knocking on doors, the Tories never understood was going to come and hit them, did very well in this election. But Theresa May is in a very weak position going into this, and she's fighting to save her political career. And is she going to be willing to throw peace in Northern Ireland under the bus, or at least to risk it, in order to save her career? It looks like yes, she is. One of the things that the DUP is said to have demanded is that Nigel Farage is involved in the Brexit negotiations. Now, I think that if there's one thing that we can learn from the election, it's that UKIP are now relevant in British politics. And actually, even a lot of people who voted for Brexit didn't think that they had to have Nigel Farage there to make that happen, because they don't think that he represents their politics in general. Lots of people who I interviewed about Brexit before the referendum were voting leave, people in the streets of Doncaster and places like that, hated Nigel Farage. They didn't think he was their man. Obviously, there's people who do like him, but most of the country doesn't. This is why he can't get a constituency, because every time he's run anywhere in the country, even the most popular places for him, most people tactically vote for the best placed candidate to beat him because they hate him so much. So the idea that the DUP is going to be able to impose on the Brexit negotiations a man so widely hated in politics and with such radical right views is very worrying. And the problem with that is that what the Brexit process will do is cement a whole set of things like our relationships with other countries. It will last a very long time. It's not like one election. It's more important than that. It's a long-term process that we're agreeing the direction of now. Once you go in that direction, it's very hard to change it. So that's probably the most pernicious thing I think that the DUP could have, a say over for us, is if they do get someone, it probably won't be Farage. They'll withdraw that. That's the kind of negotiating position. They'll get someone who we haven't heard of, but who's just as awful, into that position, and that's a real worry. I think you keep an eye on that very much. And also, there's a set of issues that you can imagine the Tories kind of giving the DUP because they think that people don't really care about them. This is, so for example, if you think about government policy on climate change, the DUP a lot of their MPs are climate deniers. And absolutely you can imagine the government, just throwing a bit of climate denial into their rhetoric just to keep the DUP on side, for example, and we should worry about that. There's this interesting kind of whole narrative around foreign states' involvement in Brexit, and the story we uncovered indicated some potential links with the Saudi government, although we don't know that for sure yet. There's discussion about the Russian state involvement, and there's a question about Farage's links with meeting the Russian ambassador and so on. And I think that on the one hand, we've got to be cautious because lots of people voted for Brexit, not because Farage told them to, but because they were really angry with the establishment. and there's a tendency of the establishment to say, oh, this wasn't, people didn't mean to do this, it was all a big mistake, actually it was just the Russians, it wasn't us. And no, the main reason Brexit happened is people do hate the establishment, and people are right to hate the establishment. It's very good reason. I voted Remain. I'm very passionately, support staying in the EU. But people voted Leave because they hate the establishment primarily, and they wanted to give the establishment a massive kicking, and the establishment told them very clearly how to kick them, which was vote Leave. So they did. But at the same time, we should absolutely be asking questions about where people like Nigel Farage and various of the Leave campaigns got all their money from. Who is it, in whose interest was it that this happened? Who's benefiting from it? And the fact that Farage is now listed as a person of interest by the FBI is obviously absolutely vital, and he should be held to account for that.